You like, okay.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an important event that will officially open the Kestenberg Collection to the public online. In 1981, Dr. Judith Kestenberg, who founded Child Development Research in 1961, launched the international study of organized persecution of children alongside her husband, Milton Kestenberg. This ambitious project involved the Kestenbergs and their associates traveling the world to interview over 1,500 individuals, child survivors of the Holocaust, children of Nazis, and observers of child persecution. To ensure privacy, the mental health professionals on the team developed psychologically oriented interviews that were audio recorded. With the help of trained volunteers in over 20 countries, they documented the experiences of 1,531 child survivors and witnesses of Nazi persecution. The interviews were conducted across the world, including in the US, Germany, Israel, Austria, and many more. This important collection was donated to the Oral History Division at the Harman Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University more than 10 years ago and went through a process of digitalization. However, until now, it was only available for researchers by request. It is with great pleasure that I announce that from today onward, the collection is open to the public digitally through the website of the Israeli National Library. This includes the recorded interviews as well as the written transcriptions. So our event echoes of children's survival, opening the Kestenberg Archive Online together with the Oral History Division, the Leo Baeck Institute, and the Israeli Association for Oral History, marks the launch of digital access to the Kestenberg Collection. And this archive holds immense significance, and the event promises insightful conversation between two experts. Dr. Eva Fogelman, deeply involved in and knowledgeable about the collection, will deliver a conversation with Dr. Sharon Kangisser Cohen that will offer valuable perspectives on the meticulous process of acquiring and digitizing of the collection. Dr. Eva Fogelman is a psychologist in private practice in New York, a social psychologist, author, and filmmaker. Along with Bella Savran, she's the pioneer of starting groups for second generation of Holocaust survivors in the US and Israel at Hebrew University. She is the co-director of Child Development Research, which hosts the International Study of Organized Persecution of Children, which today is the Kestenberg Holocaust Child Survivor Archive. Dr. Fogelman was recently honored by the Psychohistory Forum for her lifetime achievement. She was co-founder and director of the training program for psychotherapy for generations of Holocaust and related trauma, and the Jewish Foundation for Children Rescuers, currently the Foundation for the Righteous. Dr. Fogelman is a founder of the Second Generation Movement and the Hidden Children Foundation. She is the writer and co-producer of the award-winning Breaking the Silence, The Generation After the Holocaust. Among her many publications is Conscience and Courage, The Generation After the Holocaust, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And Dr. Sharon Kangisser Cohen, the director of Eli and Diana Zborowski Center for the Study of the Holocaust at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at the Yad Vashem. She is also the editor-in-chief of Yad Vashem Studies at Yad Vashem. Sharon was the former director of the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People and the Oral History Division of the Harman Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. She holds a PhD from the Hebrew University in the fields of Holocaust studies. She is, in addition, a lecturer at Rothberg School for International Students at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has published numerous articles relating to post-war lives of survivors of the Holocaust, and she's currently working on the publication of child survivor Yehuda Bacon's post-war diaries. As usual, we will have a conversation of about 45 minutes and then a short Q&A. So Sharon and Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our hosts, the Leo Baeck Institute and the Institute, the Oral History Division and the Israel Association of Oral History. I'm very excited to introduce Eva and to speak to Eva about a project that her and I have been involved in for many, many years. And which really, you know, it's one thing to begin a project, it's another thing to complete one, which I think is a wonderful feeling, and then to also see it grow and develop beyond ourselves. And now it is with basically everybody who enters the site of the National Library that can actually view this remarkable collection. But I met Eva in 2002 in New York City when me and my family moved there for a while. And one of the first people that I wanted to meet in New York was Eva Fogelman, because her work was so important to my own studies. And she, from the moment I met Eva, she's been a wonderfully generous, interesting, wonderful woman, and deeply committed to the cause of survivor testimony, survivors, second generation. And she immediately, after this initial conversation, offered me a job in New York coding interviews from what she said is one of the most wonderful archives, the Kestenberg Archives, and would I be interested in coding the archives according to all sorts of parameters. So I even began my work with Kestenberg Archives even before I even got to the Oral History Division. And I have to say, though, I wasn't a very good coder and it didn't really work out that well. But because I can't even remember why, but it isn't something that lasted, but our relationship did. So Eva, thank you for all of your generosity and over the many years and our wonderful relationships that we've built together. And I've really been so impressed by your work and by your enthusiasm for the subject matter. And my question to you, as we open this event, is really to think about or to ask you, how did this begin for you? How did your passion, how did your interest, which led you ultimately to be part of the Kestenberg Archives, where does it begin? Can you think about a moment?
First, I want to say, Sharon, that if it wasn't for Sharon, there would be no finished product to be presented to the Israeli National Library in Israel. And Sharon is just, she's just a crackerjack in terms of what she was able to do with what we gave her. You know, don't forget, when we started in 1981, we didn't have computers. Everything was typed. And so then everything had to be, you know, digitized, and she did, and a lot of the interviews still had to be translated to other languages, and she did everything in such a short time. I mean, it was like miraculous. It was something that I was always hoping would happen with the archive, and so this is a very, very special day for me. I started doing groups for children of Holocaust survivors in 1976 in Boston. And then one of the psychoanalysts in Boston told me that there was a group that meets regularly about the psychological effect of the Holocaust on second generation at the American Psychoanalytic Association. So that's where, and Judith Kestenberg was one of the leaders of that group. So that's where I first met her in 1976. And then I had invited her to come and speak to the conference that I organized in 1979 for the second generation. Then I invited her to speak at some other conference I was organizing. And in 1984, we had an American gathering of Holocaust survivors in Philadelphia. And so by that time, I was in touch with Judith because I would see her every year at the conferences. I also saw her at the International Psychoanalytic in Jerusalem. We spent some time together. And she said that she started interviewing child survivors, and she had a table at the conference for child survivors, and people would sign up. And then she had a certain hour, she said, all the people who are children come in, to a certain room. So that's where it all began to mushroom. And then Judith Kestenberg and her husband, Milton Kestenberg, who was an attorney who did a lot of work with reparations, and myself began to hold meetings in New York on a monthly basis for child survivors. And then one person brought another person. And so that's how that all began. And at the meetings, which did not have any particular theme, people just spoke about what their experiences were. We would ask them to, would they be interested in being interviewed? And of course, many initially were very reluctant to do that. And then after a while, word got around that the interview process was very therapeutic for the child survivors. And so they encouraged each other to do the interviews. So that's how I got started.
So you worked quite closely with Judith Kestenberg over many years. And what could you say about who she was in terms of?
Well, first thing I have to tell you is that she was very, very driven. I remember we had the child survivors had a picnic, and myself and my at that time my husband to be and Milton took the train to Philadelphia to be at the picnic, and on the way back she's reading books about Auschwitz. She doesn't stop reading, and my husband was just commenting about she never gives up on Auschwitz, which turned out to be where her parents had been killed. She came from Poland. She studied psychoanalysis and medical school in Austria, and in the 30s. And then her family told her not to come back to Poland and go to the United States, where her sister, who's an attorney, already was. And so she came to the United States, continued to study psychoanalysis. She was very much interested in children. So she wrote her initial book was about parent-child interaction, the psychosexual development of children. She formed a program for parents and children that now has been replicated in other places, looking at the mother-child interaction, and from that to be able to diagnose how the child will develop psychologically. She was using the Laban method, and there's a whole group of now people using the KMP method. And when she first came to the United States, she did not talk about the Holocaust at all. She didn't want to hear about it. When her husband's sister came to the United States and she wanted to talk about it, she didn't want to hear much about it, even though she lived amongst Holocaust survivors on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And then what happened is she started getting some child survivors in her psychoanalytic treatment, and she was trying to figure out what was happening with some of these children, the symptoms that they were having. And she would share with Milton Kestenberg, her husband, and he began to tell her, well, this is related to the Holocaust. And then she realized that in order to understand them, she had to study history of what had happened in order to be able to help these children understand why they may have certain symptoms. For example, one child, his knee would hurt every time he heard some kind of a noise. And then it turns out that he was in Bergen-Belsen and he heard all the bombs at the end of the war. And then he fell on the floor and hurt his knee. And had she not known, this history, she would not have understood how that was related to him. And I have to say that she would call me like 7 o'clock in the morning. I would already be getting phone calls. She had already read, depositions and interviews, and she was relentless. And every place she went, any conference, she would spend most of her time interviewing child survivors. And she met some incredible people that, spoke for the first time. She met a priest in Poland who shared with her that he, in fact, was a hidden Holocaust child survivor. And a Christian family had rescued him. His parents never came back for him, and he became a priest, and that was the first time that he shared that. She also interviewed Nicholas Frank, who was Hans Frank's son in Germany, and Hans Frank was the man who was the general who oversaw everything that happened in Poland during the war, and on in terms of her. And also, she was also very good in getting interviewers who are other psychoanalysts and mental health professionals. In Israel, particularly, I want to call out Dr. Yolanda Gampel, who is emeritus from Tel Aviv University, who has done like about 350 interviews with Holocaust child survivors who live in Israel. And I have to say that Judith and Milton allowed me to get married at their estate at Sands Point, Long Island, which was overseeing the ocean. And for her, it was also her Jewish wedding, because she, just married Milton, probably just at the Justice of the Peace. And her children, just had something very small at home, and also did not marry Jew. And so it was really a happy occasion, not just for me, but also for her and Milton.
Wow. It's interesting because when I was reading a little bit about her, there's lots that is written about her peripherally, but there's this one story where basically after the First World War, there were children who had been orphaned as a result of the First World War, and she and her mother convinced her father to open some sort of home to look after children who had been victims or had suffered. And so her propensity and her sensitivity towards children as victims already begins when she's a child herself in Tarnów, in Poland. And it's really, so on the one hand, we have, the personal story, and then the terrible fate of her family during the Shoah and the loss. And then coming across groups of people who are emotional or issues that they would like to discuss in a therapeutic setting. And then she comes across the issue of child survivors when it becomes very much important part of her life. So you have the personal background, and then yet she re-meets it on the Upper West Side in New York, and then has to think, open up the discussion of their past, but in a sense, her past her past and her loss as well. And so I think one thing that's interesting when we come look at our work is the position of all of us as researchers, and where are our stories, or who we are and why are we interested in this subject or in these topics, and how we come to the research that we do. And often it is something personal or subjective that motivates. And the question for me to you is, Eva, is how have you come to this work? So much energy, effort, thought, time has been put into the issue of child survivors, the issue of the rescuer, which is, another very important part of your work, and then the second generation and the third generation. So in terms of yourself, how have you come to this?
Well, my mother was a child survivor. She was, I should tell you that the definition of a child survivor was anyone who is 13 or under at the start of persecution in their country. So if we're talking about Poland, we're talking about September 1, 1939. If we're talking about Germany, we're talking about January 30th, 1933. If we're talking about Austria, we're talking about March of 1938 when the Anschluss happened, and and on, and on. So my mother was a child during the war in Vyshkov, which is not far from Warsaw. When the bombs started falling, her family got on a horse and buggy and started escaping, and I won't tell you the rest of the route. It takes too long. My father my father had been in the Polish army, and then when that disbanded, he was in Belarus, and then ultimately got into the partisans because of a Belarusian who had been in the Belarusian partisans and helped him get in. And also while he was in the woods, Mr. Ivan Safanov helped my father and his comrade get food while they were hiding in a ditch, and would bring their lice-infested clothes and wash it and bring it back. And so my commitment to the rescuers comes from that. And obviously my work is the second generation because I am a child of Holocaust survivors. And third generation is because I have a son who is a third generation of Holocaust survivors. And I would say that, I guess like one thing has sort of led to another, even though, I published my book on the rescuers in 1994, that topic, never ends, it's, and it's always, it's always ongoing. And once you get into this work, it never ends. I think, Sharon, that maybe it's time that I asked you how you got involved in the work that you've been doing.
Sure. Eva, I think I didn't have a personal story or connection. My father was born in Lithuania and left when he was a child to South Africa. My mother was born in South Africa. But a lot of the stories that, my connection or interest in the Shoah relates to an ex-boyfriend. So the ex-boyfriend who I had for many years, grandmother, was a survivor from the Kovno ghetto. And she survived the war, and she unfortunately lost her husband and her young son, who was then my ex-boyfriend was named after the young son. So there was a lot of, obviously, issues of naming and names in the second generation and the third generation. Anyway, so I found her an amazing woman, a fascinating woman, and she was actually the first person I interviewed. And I was, 17 years old, and always shared a very important part of my life, and taught me a lot about the Shoah and about, what we've really come to understand as these kind of awful dilemmas or choiceless choices, and the emotional burden really of not just surviving during the war, but surviving after war and the challenges. So it came through a personal story, but not necessarily directed at my personal story. And then, I became more interested in the work based on the teachers that I had when I started studying more about the Shoah, also in Australia with Professor Colin Tatz, who was a marvelous lecturer, encouraged me to go to Yad Vashem and do a course at Yad Vashem, which I did. And then I started studying a master's at the Hebrew University. And one of the reasons why I'm still involved is because I had wonderful teachers. One of them is with us today, is Professor Dalia Ofer. And we know that what keeps us involved in our studies is really the people we study with and the people we learn from. So I think Holocaust studies is a very emotionally, obviously difficult topic, but one that if you are surrounded by good people, makes it a manageable, but also very much of a worthwhile journey. And I think that interviewing survivors, for the most part, has been really probably, I would say, the great privilege of being involved in this work. And that all of us who have interviewed survivors for decades now and continue to really have gained an enormous amount in our own lives, and also in terms of hopefully have helped them, given them an opportunity to tell their story. But it's interesting because I was reading, as you mentioned, Judith Kestenberg reached out to, mental health professionals and psychologists themselves, also who were child survivors. And there's an article that was published in one of her publications by Dr. Paul Valent from Australia, the psychiatrist, right? Who talked about the time that he was interviewed by Judith Kestenberg. And it's a fantastic article. And I hadn't read it for a long time, and I was reading it in terms of this event. And he spoke about just how, very, very, very slowly, it took a long time to convince Paul Valent to actually tell his story, right? First of all, as the classic case, he didn't realize he was a child survivor. She points it out that he is, and then slowly persuades him to interview. And he flies from Australia to New York for this interview, right? And he describes this his feeling. And he mentions some very interesting things, which I'd like you to relate to, just because of the dynamic of the Kestenberg collection is very different to the collections that we know from that predated it, whether it's historical commissions or David Boda interviews or Yad Vashem interviews, and then to later interviews, whether it's Fortunoff archives or Spielberg Visual History Archive. There was something about her methodology and her approach which makes this collection not just unique, not only because it's 1,500 interviews across a huge geographical expanse, but there was a particular approach. And Paul Valent in this article explained a little bit, but I want to know from you, Eva, what was the approach for interviewing for the Kestenberg archives? What were you trained in a specific in a way to interview? Were you supervised? How did it work? Because we don't have the backstory of the methodology, which is so important. I think so important to understand the collection.
First, I want to say that you had an incredible mentor who's also a mentor of mine, Dalia Ofer, and you stand on the shoulders of a great, great woman who also has been relentless in contributing to our understanding of what happened to all different aspects and of people in the Holocaust. Judith obviously was a psychoanalyst, and what she wanted from the interview is she wanted the interviewers to understand, one, why is the person giving the interview in the first place? And so you begin to think about it as you hear the person talking. And so one of the things that comes up is that many child survivors have a lot of survivor guilt. Why me? Why did I survive? Why did my siblings not survive? Why did my, in certain cases, my parents not survive, or one parent not survive? And so at a certain point in the interview, if this is what you're hearing, you try to explain to the child survivor that indeed their psychology of having survivor guilt is an irrational guilt, and that it's their way of being connected to the dead rather than figuring out some other way to mourn them, and maybe figuring out some way to possibly identify with the dead rather than through something that is a useless kind of feeling, but rather doing something positive and constructive with that. Sometimes people say, talk about the interview because they feel that, particularly children, because they didn't have a childhood, they feel that they didn't have the capacity to be a good parent. And so that they want to hear from the interviewer that indeed they were able to be a good parent, despite the fact that they didn't have a role model of being a parent. The other thing that's very important in terms of the interview is that when you're a child survivor or any survivor, you have a fragmented self. You have a before the Holocaust, during, and after. And, and what you have is you have some people who are only living in the present and don't want to know anything at all about the past. You have some people who are only living in the past and are really not present in the present. And some people, their past and their present is not very satisfying. So all they're thinking about is the future. And so the interview process, and that's one of the things that the interviewer thinks about, is did you help a person integrate their self so that they feel much more that they're not just Holocaust survivors, but indeed they were people before and after. Now, obviously, that's very difficult for people who were infants who don't remember anything. The other thing that we have to remember is that Judith taught us that children remember in images. They do not have a sequential narrative in being able to tell their story. And so the interviewer must be immersed in Holocaust history. They must know the particular trajectory that an individual must have gone to. So if they lived in a house in, Warsaw, and they went into the ghetto, and then they were, taken on a train and, taken to a labor camp, or, well, many of those from the Warsaw Ghetto were taken to Treblinka and killed right away. But, what was there, or if they were in the ghetto and then they were put into a sack in the middle of the night and somebody came and took them to the country and they were hidden and were with their rescue. So the interviewer needed to know what was the trajectory, what was the sequential narrative that this child must have gone through until liberation. And so that was also part of the process. The other thing that Judith developed is, how do you interview people who hardly have any memory at all? So she developed the kinesthetic method, which is that she would try to have the children imagine, let's say if they were on the train, who held you on the train? How were you carried? Did they hold you this way? Did they hold you that, And so people began to imagine, certain things that they had never thought about. What's very interesting is that some of the people who had not spoken Polish for years after the interview all of a sudden began to remember lullabies that their parents had given them. The other thing, I had one experience where a woman came and she said, I got a letter from the people who from the daughter of the people who rescued me, and that woman was also a child with her during the war, and they want to come to America, and I don't want them to come. I don't want to see them. And through the interview, I helped her figure out, indeed, that she was afraid, because what happened is that when she would cry at night, the rescuer, instead of taking her into a bed, would yell at her, to sleep, because she was waking up the other people. And once she got over what had happened and the fear that she had, she was able to say to the child survivor, to the Polish child, please come to America. And it was such a healing experience for them. The other thing that happened with some of the interviews is that when we were able to help the child survivors know how they got from place to place and where they were, some of them went back to, in fact, where they were and did the route of what had happened to them during the war. And when you go back to a place where you were that was such a scary place for you, all of a sudden, you don't have that fear that you lived with your whole life, to see something that is tranquil. The other thing is, that one might pick up in the interview is shame. That child survivors might be ashamed of something that they might have done, or something that somebody else made them do, or how they were treated. And again, for being able for the interviewer to see that, this person is full of shame, and helping them work through that shame in the interview is very helpful. Now, this, you have to realize, these are not psychotherapy sessions. So that, obviously, if somebody really needs a lot more help, it may, one may suggest that maybe they want to continue talking. The other thing that obviously we did at the interview is encourage people to participate in the groups that we had. We helped start organizations all over the country for child survivors, and then we had conferences that have been meeting annually first. And then, anyway, lots of other stuff happened as a result of the interview. I do want to say one thing about the beginning of the interview is we just, sort of like psychoanalysis, if you will. It's very open-ended. The only instructions we begin by saying is, we'd like you to talk about your life, before, during, and after the Holocaust, so that begins to give a little bit of a cognitive map to the individual that, we want to cover these three areas. And then we just go with the flow as to, how this child survivor would like to share their story.
It's interesting because I think that it differs. Obviously, there's differences in collections in the way it's done, and also the philosophy behind it, which is important for us as researchers to know when we use the materials in order to understand the context and how it was created. And one thing that that you're reminding me of, that also Paul Welland he echoes, is that he's talking about the fact that the Kestenberg interview allowed him to bring up precious memories, as he said, but also allowed him to adjust the meaning in his life. So it's not just about recovering recovering an identity, right? You're a survivor yourself. You're a child survivor yourself who was hidden during the war. Therefore, you're a child survivor. Through the process of the interview, memories surface in order to regain that, what he calls, and he said it's interesting, is that it's not an interview. She helps us create a story, right? And so the memories create a story, and then there is a part in which there are the gaps, right? And she says, well, imagine, as you said, imagine how it felt like in terms of the body movement, which is one of her approaches. Imagine what this was like, or the situation, or the story. So that's the third. And then the idea of integrating yourself about your approach to who that child was and what they went through as you as an adult looking back on this past, right? So it's a whole, a whole movement in an interview. It's not just about recording what happened to you, how did you survive the war, but it's a whole process of recovery, a process of imagination, and then a process of trying to help the person leave the room or leave the interview with a sense of an awareness, an understanding, a kindness to themselves, or whatever. And so one thing that I would ask you is how, if, for example, Judith Kestenberg, an interviewer, was saying to interviewees, imagine, you might not remember, but imagine how can we, as you say, historians relate to interviews where interviewees are imagining or being asked to imagine? What, is this something, that we can, you wrote about the rescuing self. How do you relate to parts of the interview which are imagined?
Well, that's why it depends on the kind of research that an interviewer, that a researcher wants to do. So, and whether we have that information in the interviews we have. So one may want to read a few interviews to see whether it's appropriate for the kinds of questions that they want to know. But for example, if you want to know, what was it like for children in Auschwitz, right? So you take all those interviews of those children who were in Auschwitz, and then you will get a picture of what it was like for the children in Auschwitz. So some have better memory, some have more vivid memories, and others will have less vivid memories and more imagination. But you're able to sort of piece that together in terms of getting a picture of what it was like for a child in Auschwitz, for example. Or let's say if you want to know, what it was like for children to be in hiding. And so that you take the children, obviously that's a big category, larger than those who survived concentration camps. And so, you then narrow it down to, do you want those children who were in a convent? Or do you want children who were with a family? Or do you want children who were, in the woods? Or do you want the children who were partisans? So that, when you have more than one interview, then ultimately you can get a picture of what it was like for the child to have experienced that. Obviously, you're not going to be using these interviews if you want to know, what, particular dates or, necessarily, places. You don't want to be, as a historian, you don't want to be using those interviews for that. But I think, it depends again on the kinds of questions that you're asking. You read a couple of interviews and you see whether it's for you. The other thing, and that's something that as a researcher was very difficult for me, is that our questions that we added on changed with time. So for example, we began with, sort of having questions and as time went on, we realized, oh yes, we want more questions about Jewish identity. Or then, as time went on, some of the survivors were getting, let's say, to their 60s, and we'd say, oh yes, we want some more questions about what it's like for a child survivor to age. So that, some of that changed. And obviously, depending on the, if we're talking about you know, having interviews, let's say from Hungary before Glasnost and, you know, after Glasnost, you know, or in Poland, you know, before Glasnost or after Glasnost. So if it was in the 80s, you know, it might be a different kind of, you know, interview as opposed to after, you know, after, you know, the communists left. So that as a researcher, you also want to know the date of when the interview was done and what country the survivor was currently living in as well.
Eva, one last question from me, and then you can ask me questions. But I
haven't asked you anything yet.
I know, because just one last is that when I read the Kestenberg interviews, there's a lot of personal material about sexuality, about intercourse, masturbation, which had to do with a lot with the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic connection to their trauma. And so sometimes I think putting all of these interviews online and open them, there's a part of me that feels a little protective over these individuals and their stories. How do you respond to intimate stories being open online and accessible in this way?
Well, I think that all the interviews are don't have the people's names. They have initials, and so I think that that's something that's helpful. And you know, when you talk about that, so Judith Kestenberg did not want the interviews videotaped. These were only audio recordings, and the reason for that is that she wanted individuals to be able to share something more personal that they may not share if it was a video recording that was being shared with the family. And so that's why we also only used initials rather than names. And then if people had, let's say, they wanted to say, you know, my child is, you know, has been a problem since he was born, you know, and I've never known what to do with him. So it was, again, the kind of interview that, you know, she wanted the person to be as open as possible. But I will say that every once in a while, there were interviewees who said, I have to tell you something, please, you know, shut the tape recorder off. And, you know, that happened. And so obviously there are things that, you know, that were shared that are not part of the interview. So,
okay.
Sharon, I'd like to ask you what, you know, you got so much material and you did it so fast, and, you know, you had to find translators, and, you know, how did you do it all?
How do we do it all? Well, first of all, we got, you had this wonderful collection that you were looking after, but had been in a library somewhere in the States and needed to get rid of the collection. I remember there was a sense of urgency that they couldn't keep the collection. So we thought about getting it out to the Hebrew University. It was in, you know, the state was in Florida, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And so we, you know, it was very lucky I was, you know, at the time I was working in the oral history division, and the head of the Institute for Contemporary Jewry was Professor Danny Blattman. And he was completely on board with doing whatever it took to bring the collection. He had no. So when you have someone who's happy to join the project, it obviously makes it a lot easier. So basically, we applied for a claims conference grant, which allowed us to begin. And so, you know, I remember the day that we got these boxes. It was a cold Jerusalem winter, and these boxes arrived, and yes, it was rather overwhelming to see cassettes after cassettes after cassette. And we knew that we had to digitize the cassette because we don't have cassette players for the most part. And more to the point that the cassette would disintegrate and we needed to preserve the collection. So We essentially also were lucky enough to give us some metadata of names and dates and we had to match up what we had. It was kind of an inventory. As a side, which unfortunately becomes Ronnie's problem, is that I wouldn't say that 100% of the collection is matched and found. There's definitely pieces that had no either missing tape or a missing transcript, but so I can't say this is a 100% digitization project, and I think the person that's left with the headache is Ronnie and not me and not Sharon afterwards and then after Eva, but there's an element of absence and missing, which unfortunately we can't. We're very lucky enough that Judith Kestenberg had money for transcripts. We know that most collections aren't transcribed, and transcribing is expensive, although probably we'll get more. And we had these wonderful transcripts. So we had to match the tapes with the transcripts and then create a sense of, well, how do we catalog? It's one thing to digitize. So we sent all of the cassettes outsourced to a wonderful company in Tel Aviv who digitized it. We scanned the transcripts, but then we all had to bring it together in the catalog. And the one part of it is creating the metadata in terms of just entering it into the university cataloging system, which was done by a very experienced librarian, Wendy Luterman. But more to the point is that we wanted to be able to catalog it, not just the name and a date of interviewer, of the metadata, just the basic information. We wanted to really give as, a proper abstract and search and turn to the collection. So what we did is really, because we were lucky to have got the grant from the claims conference, is hire a few individuals who would write abstracts, would read the materials and create an abstract, and we trained them that what we were looking for, and divided them into what types of keywords. And essentially we had people working on creating these abstracts, and also people who had different languages, because some of the interviews are in a different language, and we had people involved in that. And we had a wonderful administrator of the entire project, a woman by the name of Nava. And Nava really was a genius in being able to coordinate between the digitization, the scanning, and all the people working on the abstracts. We had quite a few volunteers from overseas, the overseas school that was part of the project. Someone who actually also was a volunteer but used the work in her own research. And eventually we pulled it together. There was one thing though that did become apparent, is that for the people who were reading and abstracting the interviews, that emotionally it actually was quite difficult after a while to keep. I mean, these testimonies are they're very sad, as most testimonies of the show are. When you're reading about the testimony of child survivors or child survivors who, essentially lose their entire worlds, their families, their parents, and in some cases or, suffer deprivation, harassment, abuse. It's really, and so, there was a point at which some of the interviewers said that it's actually too hard for them to carry on abstracting and reading this material, which is part of and at some point we organized actually a one-day workshop for everyone who was involved to speak to people who were able to help them process what they had been doing and what they had been reading, to think about, the effect, the emotional effect that this kind of work has on people who are not necessarily involved in it because this is their subject matter, but because, it's interesting and it's a job, but they didn't realize at some point the cumulative effect of reading these testimonies. And eventually, the job got done. I would say for the most part, it's working with someone who's able to, agree to the project being done in terms of, Danny Bloodman and his support. But I would say it's the expertise. It's, Wendy, who is a very experienced librarian, as well as Nava, who was fantastic in terms of organization. They were able to monitor and put and pull the project, keep the project going. So that's a bit about how we did it. Nothing that was came externally. We didn't have advice. We just basically all worked it out ourselves, and were able to do the best that we could. A good enough job.
Well, you did better than a good enough job. I wanted to say one thing in relation to what you said, which is that when we trained interviewers, we would, that's one of the things that Judith and I did, is we had classes for the interviewers, and they would do they would prepare their own transcript of their interview, and then we would go over it, and that's how we trained them. And also, those of us who were in New York and were regular interviewers, we had monthly meetings ourselves to go over the interviews and to talk about our own feelings of what it was like to be doing the interviews. So it's not just the child survivors that need support, but I think that the researchers who are dealing with such emotional life and death kind of material also need support from other colleagues in order to be able to continue to do this kind of work. So I think that we need to open it up to questions that have come in.
Just one quote. This is a product of the work. I don't know if you can see it. After or during the process, I can't even remember the timing, but we had a workshop where people presented on the collection, and we created an edited volume with Professor Dani Orfe, Eva, and myself. A really, I think, a very interesting publication. So the job wasn't just to absorb it into the collection, but because the Machon is a research institute, we wanted to also create research and scholarly work from the collection, which is, I think, an important part of the step in the journey. Thank you.
And the first book that came out, which is right here, that was edited by myself and Judith Kestenberg, talks a little bit about the methodology, and I think Paul Vallant's article is there, and some of the early research that we did about the effect of the interviews and research we did about the effect of our research.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating, and we do have some questions on the chat. And of course, if there are additional questions from the audience, please just, either write on the chat or let us know, and we will give you.
Ronnie, may I say something? I
yes,
have to leave. I'm sorry that I have to leave, and so I'm, entering outside of the line. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Eva and to Sharon. Although I know so well the project, I learned a lot. And this is one of the blessings that we always have from listening to our colleagues in different projects, in different subjects, and really thank you for this. And I'm glad that Sharon showed the book, because I put the book on my table to show it. So I want just to say one comment about the issue of imagination, which is a major issue. And I think that we have to remember that we use the imagination all the time, not only when the interviewer asks you, so try to imagine. Might be that for the psychologist, this is different than for me as an historian. When I'm either interviewing or reading an interview, I know that a lot of the things are already imagined, even if it was, in the border interviews or later interviews. And the imagination does not mean that this is something that was not really in reality of when it happened. The imagination says that it is a kind of a process of memory with whatever capacities or feelings that one has when he's telling or retelling the story or what happened to him. So I wouldn't be so afraid from the issue of imagination, but rather think how we use it as an important tool as researchers in different fields of research, as a sociologist or a historian or a psychologist and so on. So I really, of course, there is a lot to be said, and I was, watching the project from the side and enjoying so much whenever I participated, and I really would like to extend my thanks to all of you, and to remind that Sharon, that we say between Sharon and Sharon, was also part of this process of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry and the Oral History Department that you now, Ronnie, is part of. And Margalit was one of it before. So, and just to mention Dov, what's the last name? Skipped my mind.
Levin.
Dov Levin, נכון, תודה רבה, thank you. So we are very fortunate to have such able people, and תודה רבה. And let's hope for a quiet Passover and for the return of the hostages.
Amen, amen.
So we can breathe again. And I apologize that I have to leave.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dalia.
Okay, thank you.
We also have several questions. One is how, a very important one, how to access the interviews. So I'll just take 1 minute from your time and say that you need to enter the central website of the Israeli National Library and just put in the search engine Kestenberg OHD, and you will have all the interviews, and you will see that they are all available online from all over the world. So you don't need to actually be at the National Library to use it. You can see it from your own house. And if you have any questions, you can actually write to the Oral History Division, and I will try to help. So that's about the question of access. Should I just read from the chat? And okay, so what Nurit is asking, should the interviewer use photos according to the Kestenberg's methodology?
What do you mean, use photos?
I think that it was related. Maybe Nurit, you wanna step in, but I think that you stated that sometimes you had to use some objects in order to steer the memory during the interviews. So,
if I may step in, my question is, can you use general photos? Let's say, of course you don't have photos from the interviewers themselves, but, you have photos from the ghetto or anything else. Did they use them to help people remember?
That's a very interesting idea. We did not use any of that, but that's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Sima is asking, did you use personal family documents in order to discuss with the child survivor?
Sometimes children would bring in documents that they had to the interview, yes.
Okay, Jacqueline is saying, thank you very much. Please, could you share some of the challenges, if any, that you faced with recruiting child survivors for the interviews?
Well, I would say that, we had our regular monthly meeting, and Judith would ask people who would want to be interviewed. And I would say in the beginning, there was a lot of reluctance to to be interviewed. And once some people were interviewed and came back and said what a good interview it was or how important it was, as I mentioned, one child, began to remember Polish, and she shared that with the group. There was another, Irene Hisme, who was a Auschwitz twin with her brother. As a result of the interviews, she began to write poetry, and she came back to the group and wrote her poetry. And so some of these things, began to inspire individuals. And Judith was such a force in terms of getting people to, to tell their story. And that was something that, that was very helpful. And she, Judith and Milton felt like the parents that some of them had lost or, didn't have, or felt that, their parents couldn't parent them after what they had been through. Judith and Milton sort of became the parents to these child survivors. And I was the American child who was, born after the Holocaust. So I was like, so there was a different relationship with me and with the Kestenbergs.
Thank you. And Martina, do you want to ask?
Yes, thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm asking whether these interviews were used only in the context of history studies or also in the disciplinary context of psychoanalysis or mental health in general, if this was shared and discussed in these other disciplinary contexts.
You mean when we had the groups with the child survivors?
Or afterwards, it's like all along the way, because I understand it's a very long, it took many years, but in general, if this was discussed in some kind of forum, because what you talked about, all the therapeutic aspect of the interview itself, it sounds to me like something very groundbreaking, that something I haven't heard of. And I'm just curious about knowing if this was discussed, among specialists, of psychoanalysis or stuff, or it just was stay there, it was focused on the interviews, on the interviewers, or was it shared more broadly?
No, I would say, well, in terms of the child survivors themselves, I would say that many of the individuals who, once they were interviewed, also wanted to meet other child survivors. And so they participated in different groups. So we're talking about Australia. There was a group for child survivors that met in Australia. We had a conference for hidden children. And as a result of that conference, 1,600 hidden children came to a conference in New York in 1991. And as a result of that, there was a group that met in Warsaw on a monthly basis of those people who came to and they brought in lots of other people. And that was sort of the impetus of a lot of hidden children in Poland when they heard about these meetings, because they were written up in the Polish paper, in the Wall Street Journal. Hidden children who had just learned that, their rescuer had died, and before they died, they told them, in fact, they weren't their child. With the hidden children, we had in New York, in the greater New York area, we had a group for, these were all self-help groups. There was a group for children who came from Belgium, a group from children who came from France, and they were led by therapists who themselves were child survivors. And so there was that kind of a follow-up, if you will, in terms of the in terms of the interviews. And then, some people are much more private, and, they gave the interview and then they, went on with their life and weren't interested in, in engaging with others.
Sharon?
Yes, thank you, Eva and Sharon. It was very interesting. Eva, you mentioned something that I found very interesting about the video and the audio, because I think that these days it will be a little bit different, because people in certain age, they film themselves and the selfie, and they aware of themselves. And the COVID also make us all be aware of our presence. Like now, for example, we are talking and we can see ourselves in the conversation. So I think if you or Sharon, if you can say something about the experience that of interviewing with video and without video, and in certain decades and certain ages.
Well, first of all, the people that we interviewed were at that time were people in their 50s. Maybe some from Germany might have been in their 60s. And I think people were pleased to know that this was going to be anonymous. There were reactions after the event, because there were all, the Fortunoff Archive at Yale was doing videos. And then obviously the interviews began with Spielberg, and they're very scripted. I don't know if you've seen the interviews from the Shoah Foundation. They're usually, sometimes not, in rare cases, but they're like an hour and a half. So it's half hour before, half hour during, and half hour after. And the interviewer interviews the people before the interview, so that, the real interview takes place without being recorded at all. And you get snippets. And here the person, was much freer to talk. So I think while the interview was going on and it was audio, and that they knew it was not going to be shared with their family, I think it helped much more to be open. And when people know that their families are going to be looking at the video, that this is what the legacy that they're leaving their children, I think they're much more constricted at times in what they would say and wouldn't say. But today with everything being visual, those individuals who did not give a testimony that is also visual, I think there's a certain kind of disappointment for the second and third generation not to have a video of, and here and there I get calls from people who want to know, can they get their parents, interview.
Yeah.
You must, I refer them to you, Ron.
Yeah, I know. I get a lot of them.
Right.
Yes. Eva, to conclude, I just want to ask something about the relevancy of this methodology for our present. So I know that you actually addressed this in the radio interview,
yes.
But I was wondering, we had a lot of children being held hostage and also being traumatized. I have been working on the documentation of October 7 for the past almost 7 months. And so one thing that you mentioned that I think we are all repeatedly echoing is that we need to take care of the interviewers and not only to worry about the interviewee, and that the circles of trauma, we need to address the way that we deal with it. But I'm wondering if you can actually speak about the relevancy of the methodology for our situation, for I don't know, interviewing children who were traumatized during the war.
So it's interesting that one of the things that the Kestenberg Archive has, that Sharon in fact wrote about, is that there were a group of children that gave depositions in Poland right after the war. And maybe Sharon, you can also comment on that a little bit. And then the difference between what the children focus on right after the war and then what they focus on, you know, many years later. I mean, today, you know, except for these small depositions, most of the child survivors were told to forget what happened and not to talk about it. And even those who went to therapy, I mean, I had patients who came to me who went to 5 days analysis a week. And when they began to talk about, you know, I was in Auschwitz, and the therapist, the psychoanalyst said, what does this have to do with your childhood? And so obviously some of the child survivors that have been, you know, immediately affected, you know, those who live near obviously you know, the Gaza border, you know, the people from the north who have been evacuated from, you know, from their homes, and those children who, you know, not knowing when they're going to be able to come back to their homes. So you're talking about a large part of the, you know, population. One thing we need to remember is that just because you have experienced trauma does not mean that you will get post-traumatic stress disorder. And even if you get post-traumatic stress disorder, it is not a condition that is always active, which means that it may get activated, you know, in certain, you know, situations. Obviously, if all of a sudden you know, you have to go into a shelter, you know, that's going to probably be a trigger, and you'll probably have some post-traumatic stress disorder. But it doesn't, you know, if we take a look at our child survivors, and so many of them, you know, are just so many accomplished people, that again, just because you've been traumatized doesn't mean that, you know, you're not going to be able to function as an individual in terms of, you know, professionally, and in, you know, in having a love relationship and having a family. So I think that that's important for people to remember, because I think what's happened in our society today, everything is trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorders, you know, and people don't understand the nuance of it. And so I think there's a tremendous fear about, you know, everybody, you know, like the whole society is going to be, you know, is going to have PTSD. Well, that's not going to, you know, that's not going to happen. Right now, we're, you know, you're all going through a trauma, you know, and which is, again, you know, it's a situation that, you know, you can't get out of, you know. But so one of the things that that fascinated me, there was a program from Hebrew University, from the social work school, and the social work school, the professors there prepared the I guess the policemen, the psychologists, whatever other caretakers there were, the guards who were going to transport the children who were hostages from wherever they were being picked up. And it was just incredible to me to see what they had thought about in terms of helping them with the transition, having, you know, stuffed animals for them, having toys for them, having stuff with, you know, color. I mean, it was just amazing, you know, how to talk to them. You know, one of the things that that's very troubling is you have a lot of, when it comes to sexual abuse, you have a lot of reporters who just want to, you know, meet the women or the men who've been sexually traumatized, and they want to hear all the details. These individuals are not ready to share it. And but reporters need to write a story, otherwise how are they going to, you know, write a story without having the details? So that has been, you know, like a moral dilemma. On the one hand, we want the world to know that there was sexual abuse. On the other hand, that's something that, you know, times may be traumatizing the sexual abuse survivor at, you know, at that particular moment. So, you know, we're all, you know, as if, you know, we're going to be, you know, have the kids talk right away. They may not be ready to talk right away. They may want to just, you know, so you have to gauge with each child, you know, what to do. And one of the things that, you know, I think when the social workers from Hebrew University were preparing, they in fact looked at other traumatized groups in history in order to learn how to cope with the present situation. And I think that opening up this archive, I hope that some of the mental health professionals will read some of these interviews and perhaps learn from that in terms of, you know, what was helpful in terms of coping, what wasn't helpful in terms of coping, which is, I think, some of the themes that the child survivors talk about in terms of, you know, what helped them cope, what didn't help them cope. The other thing we've learned from the interviews is that you know, when we think about a DP camp, you know, here you are, the war's over, you don't have a home, you know, you're basically homeless. And what we found is that for some of the child survivors, the DP camp experience for some of them was the happiest time in their life because they got to be with other children and who had experienced something similar. And so, you know, thinking more about, you know, bringing some of these children who have experienced the more severe trauma, bringing them together in some kind of a group, I think is something that is very, in the long run, will be very, very helpful, and something that we learned from, you know, from our interviews.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Dr. Fogelman and Dr. Kangisser Cohen for this fascinating conversation, and invite you all to actually go through the collection, which is, as I said, now available through the National Library. And we will actually take the opportunity to wish us all a quiet, safe, and hopefully with some good news of the Pesach holiday. And if I know there were several other questions, but I invite you all to actually turn to the speakers after we'll finish. And again, thank you so much, Eva and Sharon, for this amazing conversation.
Thank you. It was exciting.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo Baeck, and Sharon in particular for finishing it and making it all happen.
Yeah.
Thank you
very
very
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.